So to begin today's presentation, I'm going to introduce our presenters. First, we have Efraim Lopez, who is the statewide tobacco project director for the Sierra Club. In this role, he has led a statewide effort to increase awareness about tobacco product waste and environmental justice. Next up, we'll have Amanda Simpson. She is the policy analyst for the Tobacco Control and Environmental Justice Project at the Sierra Club, where she specializes in land use and urban planning. She's committed to developing statewide capacity to integrate a traditionally public health dominated field with environmental policy. Then we'll have Jamie Long, who is a senior staff attorney with the Public Health Law Center, providing legal technical assistance on commercial tobacco control issues to public health professionals and organizations, legal professionals, and advocates throughout the United States. Now I'll hand the mic over to Efraim Lopez to begin the presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Stephanie, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Again, my name is Efraim Lopez, he, him pronouns, zooming in from the Sacramento area, unceded lands of the Maidu, Miwok, and Nisenan here in Greater Sacramento. We're the Environmental Justice and Tobacco Control Project at the Sierra Club. And for those of you who are new to this topic, there are 4.5 trillion cigarettes filters are littered into our environment annually. So right now, 4.5 trillion and more added every single year. They continue to be the #1 littered item on the planet, and they pollute sidewalks, beaches, rivers, and we'll get into some of those. Next slide, please. So a lot of people will think about tobacco waste and see it on the ground and think of it as just trash, but before they even become a product, the one that happens to be the #1 littered item, there's already a ton of environmental harms that are brought to our planet and to our neighborhoods. Those include climate change, deforestation, food insecurities, and human rights. The Human Rights Watch report reports that the industry often exploits children, exposing them to nicotine, which is absorbed through the skin during harvesting. It causes dizziness, nausea, vomiting, headache, and sleepiness. They're also exposed to the pesticides and excessive heat from farming practices in general, not to mention addiction, since it's being absorbed through their skin. For climate change, tobacco cultivation, curing, manufacturing, and the transport of the product contribute significantly to climate change. The tobacco industry contributes at least 0.2% of annual global emissions. To add to that, deforestation contributes to those global emissions. So 1 in 8 trees harvested globally are used in tobacco production. If you think about it, they're wrapped in paper. Even though the filter itself is a plastic, it's a single-use plastic. Roughly 600 million trees are harvested annually. The equivalent of 5% annual global greenhouse emissions are emitted from loss of carbon sequestration. So if you think about the entire planet and all of the greenhouse gas emissions, 5% of those are contributed by the tobacco industry, which is an incredibly huge number. Food insecurity. So this is an environmental justice issue, as well as other human rights issues. There is quite a bit of food insecurity throughout the world, and 1% of total arable land is diverted to grow tobacco. 80% of this land, which occurs in low and middle income countries that already lack resources and may have food insecurities, you could be using this land to grow food or more productive or more useful product to communities. But oftentimes these communities don't have the resources to fight the investors or the investments from large multinational corporations. Next slide, please. Now going on to some of the environmental harms after all of these issues have already happened, and now you have a product and now they're on their way to the stores or into the marketplace, or in the hands of people, right? Here in California, we have unfortunately a wildfire season, and every single wildfire is devastating our state, our communities, and our planet, really. Smoking materials account for 1 in 20 home fires and 1/4 of the home fire deaths. These smoking materials also cause 38 wildfires a year in California annually on average. And what's more, to add to that, the electronic cigarettes are also known to have a propensity to explode and catch on fire, and have been described by FEMA as flaming rockets. If they're ever left on any hiking trails or outside in California, a couple of weeks ago, it was 117 degrees in my neighborhood. So you can imagine any single-use plastic out there with a battery just sitting out there, 117 degrees is much more likely to explode than in some given lab conditions. Also, air pollution, plastic pollution, and the water pollution are environmental harms that are it's a chain of contamination, as these forever chemicals just keep on affecting different areas. So areas where pedestrians commonly smoke combustible cigarettes can have more significant impacts on local air pollution than does, say, an automobile. Measurable impacts to air quality from tobacco smoke have been observed in London and Los Angeles. The plastic pollution, as I mentioned earlier, the cigarette filters are composed of a single-use non-biodegradable plastic. It's called cellulose acetate. They're not made out of cotton, and they don't ever biodegrade. So if you take anything away from this presentation, I want you guys to go home with that. These break down eventually. They start breaking down into microplastics. So they don't necessarily biodegrade, but as they begin to get mushed up on beaches by sand and the tide, they kind of fall apart, but they're exact same thing, just in microplastic form. And the statewide microplastic strategy has now listed prohibiting the sales of filtered cigarettes as a key strategy to reduce microplastic pollution. And on a whole different webinar, we can go into this for an hour or days, really, onto how microplastics are affecting our environment. They go into our fish, which eat it, and then we ourselves eat it, and we consume about a credit card. I believe it's about a credit card's worth a week of microplastics. Also on the environment, water pollution. So all these discarded cigarette filters will end up leaching the toxic chemicals such as arsenic, nicotine, polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons, and they have heavy metals like lead, copper, cadmium, and chromium into the aquatic ecosystem. So any given tobacco product, especially combustible cigarette filters, have 7,000 chemicals, hundreds of which are harmful, and about 80 of which directly cause cancer. And as those go down the chain, so they might go into a landfill, into the waterways, these chemicals all get leached. Remember, the tobacco industry is contributing heavily into these chemicals. So one by one, each of those that keep getting leached ends up being a tremendous amount of pollution into our waterways. So with this, next slide, please. I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Amanda Simpson, who will kind of walk you through a little bit of a visual representation and then tell you a little bit more about some policies we can do about this. Go ahead, Amanda.
Thank you, Efraim. So this is an image pulled from a research paper called Cigarette Smoking and Environmental Assessment of Tobacco's Global Environmental Supply Chain. The circle in red shows part of the supply chain that we most commonly talk about. Like Efraim mentioned, there are 4.5 trillion cigarette filters that are discarded every year. This also includes things like cigar tips, cigarillo tips, e-cigarettes, oil pouches, and packaging. But as you can see from this conceptual framework, and from the harms that Efraim talked about during his presentation, tobacco product waste represents only a small fraction of the global environmental footprint. And like Efraim already mentioned, but because many of us also live in California, I just want to emphasize, as many of you living on the wildland-urban interface are already probably acutely aware of, our forests are really vulnerable to climate change. The 5-year average from the last 5 years or so is 37 wildfires a year that are caused by smoking. And in 2020, which is the latest Red Book data that comes from CAL FIRE, we have available that number is actually 47 wildfires. And as our forests become more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, it's really vital to reduce unnecessary sources of ignition. It's also worth noting that 1 in 20 home fires across the country are caused by smoking materials, not just wildfires, which results in an unnecessary loss of life of over 500 people every year. And given all this information, what do we do about it? There are a lot of options, and many of these options are what I call upstream solutions, meaning they mitigate some of the upstream environmental and social harms while also preventing the accumulation of tobacco litter. So the stuff in the red circle. But some of these policies are things that many tobacco control advocates are already familiar with. But for any non-traditional environmental partners in the room, I'll kind of break them down a little bit. So, there's things like comprehensive flavor restrictions, which can help prevent youth initiation to tobacco products, which ultimately reduces demand for those products. Density restrictions, which Jamie is going to go into a little bit more, but there's a higher density of tobacco retailers in low-income communities of color because the industry has targeted these communities. So limiting that density can eliminate some of the disproportionate accumulation of tobacco litter and also prevent exposure in those communities to industry marketing. Tobacco Endgame, which is a campaign to end tobacco use and nicotine addiction altogether. Both Manhattan Beach and Beverly Hills have passed ordinances prohibiting the sale of tobacco products altogether. There's also education campaigns. These can be really effective for youth in particular, because youth and young adults, research has shown that youth and young adults are really concerned about climate change and environmental degradation. So this is a really great way to engage youth and young adults. And then there's also tobacco-free finance campaigns, which work by asking public, private, nonprofit institutions and individuals to divest from tobacco. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we will be hosting a webinar sometime in mid-November, which we'll provide the link for in partners later when we have it. And these are some policies that help to indirectly reduce or eliminate demand for tobacco products. Jamie will be talking about these in depth because they're both in the toolkit, but ending the sale of environmentally damaging products such as single-use e-cigarettes, cigar tips, and filters. These can have an indirect effect on demand because filters are known to make tobacco initiation easier. And they can mask the harsh flavor of tobacco and give users a false sense of harm reduction. And then alarmingly, the most recent 2021 National Youth Tobacco Survey has also shown an alarming trend that youth are now starting to prefer disposable e-cigarettes. So things like Puff Bar to reusable e-cigarettes. And then the last one is just ensuring compliance with existing state, federal, local hazardous waste laws, because nicotine e-liquid is an acute hazardous waste and has special requirements as such. So by ensuring retailers are in compliance, this can create some additional burdens on the retailer, which can hopefully in the long term maybe discourage some retailers from selling e-cigarettes in the first place. Oops. Okay, and I won't go into this in too much detail, but Planning documents are another way to really pull environmental justice advocates and people working on natural resource, air, water, and fire issues into the fold. General plans have a lot of overlap with TPW issues. SB 1000, for example, is called Environmental Justice and Local Land Use Planning, and it requires that some jurisdictions actually address disproportionate environmental impacts in their general plans. And then things like community wildfire plans, because like I mentioned earlier, reducing ignition sources is really important for preventing wildfire. And tobacco products are an unnecessary source of ignition. And then of course, climate action plans, because like Efraim mentioned earlier, tobacco contributes, or the industry contributes 0.2% of global emissions every year. And that is honestly a lowball number, because that is what is self-reported by the industry. And it also doesn't include the loss of carbon sequestration from things like deforestation. So all of these things are, unnecessary, because it's for a product that, kills half of people that use it as directed. And with that, we are also recruiting for our young adult board. We are working on some really exciting things, like we're working on a podcast, we're developing TikTok, and we provide organizing summit or organizer training, and we're doing planning summits. And I will put the link in the chat for that, but if anyone is interested, or if you know someone that might be interested, you can find more information on the link that I'm going to provide. And with that, I will pass it on to Jamie.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you to Efraim as well. That was a really compelling overview of the environmental harms of tobacco. So I am Jamie Long, as was mentioned. I'm a senior staff attorney with the Public Health Law Center, and I'm going to be talking about a tobacco product waste toolkit that we released earlier this year. So focusing on some of the policy options that local jurisdictions can pursue. So before that, I'll just mention briefly, we're the Public Health Law Center. For those who aren't familiar with us, we're located at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. We also acknowledge that we are in the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people and appreciate the ongoing stewardship, spiritual connections, and lifeways developed in the homeland upon which this law school sits. At the Public Health Law Center, we are committed to policy that improves the public health, which to us means taking into account the social determinants of health, adverse childhood experiences, and inequity in general. Also want to acknowledge that there's a difference between traditional and commercial tobacco. Throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to the environmental impacts of tobacco, but I want to clarify that I'm talking specifically about industrial scale commercial tobacco production, not traditional tobacco, as it's still used religiously, medicinally, and ceremonially in many different cultures. And finally, the Public Health Law Center offers free legal technical assistance to communities, public health advocates, and other partners. We provide publications like the one we'll be talking about today, presentations like this one, but we do not offer direct legal representation, nor do we lobby. So the toolkit that we released earlier this year contains 5 parts. The first is an overview of many of the problems, environmental harms that come from tobacco product waste. I won't go into that in much detail today because Amanda and Efraim did a nice job of highlighting those. And then 3 policy options that I'll discuss. And finally, at the end, a policy findings section. So this toolkit is intended for California communities that are ready to address the harms, environmental harms of tobacco product waste. As I mentioned, the environmental threat, I won't go into much detail on, but I do want to mention that filters, which as Efraim mentioned, are the #1 polluted item, cigarette butts in the world. We now know, based on industry documents, that these so-called filters were actually developed as a marketing ploy, and in fact make cigarettes more dangerous by allowing for easier inhaling, encouraging more frequent puffing and giving consumers a false sense that they are actually reducing their health risks when they are not. So in addition to the environmental rationale and motivation for tackling filtered cigarettes, there's also a health-based argument too. So in terms of some of the specific harms of types of the waste that is produced from tobacco products, no tobacco products are readily recyclable, and electronic cigarettes in particular are likely considered hazardous waste under legal definitions for several reasons. One is that they contain nicotine, which is an acute hazardous waste under the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It was listed as such in the 80s when it was being used as a pesticide, but the EPA has been clear that e-cigarettes are still acute hazardous waste, considering that nicotine remains still extremely toxic to humans. The second reason they are likely hazardous waste is that they contain batteries that California's hazardous waste regulators consider to be electronic waste. So this is actually hazardous waste that cannot be disposed of as regular trash. And then the third reason is that they contain many heavy metals that are listed in what's known as Appendix X, which is California's presumptive hazardous waste list. So for all of these reasons, when we're talking about electronic cigarettes in particular, they are likely hazardous waste under federal and state law. If you want to go into a little bit more detail on some of the background on tobacco product waste, we do have a frequently asked questions guide to take a look at. And also wanted to mention that we have the toolkit that we provided is meant to be a companion to our tobacco retail license model ordinance. So some of the definitions and other things that we'll be drawing from are located in that model ordinance. So now I'll get into the policy options. So the first option that we propose in the toolkit are sales restrictions. And so we include a model sales restriction that's focused on tobacco product waste in particular. And so this would prohibit the sale of single-use tobacco products. So that's defined as tobacco products that have filters or mouthpieces, such as filtered cigarettes, cigars, or cigars with plastic tips. Also, electronic smoking devices that are not refillable. So the single-use puff bar or other electronic smoking devices. The second category that would be prohibited for sale is unrecyclable packaging. And this would include plastic-coated paper or paperboard. It would not include pure cardboard, paperboard, or aluminum, which are recyclable. And we drew on the definition from a proposed bill, AB 1080, which would impose a comprehensive regulatory scheme on packaging, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. There is an exception in the model as proposed for child-resistant packaging, such as liquid nicotine, which is required under federal law to be single-use since there's nicotine residue. So we would make an exception for that for the unrecyclable packaging category. And then the third category would be mixed hazardous waste, which would be liquid for use in an e-cigarette in combination with electronic waste. So all three of these categories would be proposed for prohibition of sale. The benefits of doing this, one is that it would certainly save money in litter collection. We know that local jurisdictions in California are required to keep trash out of local waterways, and that can often add up to be a significant expenditure for many local governments. So this would help with that problem, given the propensity for cigarettes to wind up in being littered on public streets. And the second, as was mentioned, is the human health argument, which is that filtered cigarettes are, in fact, more dangerous to health. There are other alternatives for sales restrictions, as Amanda mentioned. One would be a complete sales prohibition, as has been done in Manhattan Beach or Beverly Hills, and this could certainly be motivated all or in part by the environmental concerns of litter from both electronic cigarettes and from other tobacco products. But we crafted this policy in particular as a proposal that would be focused on the most common harm from tobacco products, and that would be single-use products or products that are not recyclable. So has this type of policy been considered? Yes, it has at the state level, both in California and New York. There was a bill introduced this past year, Assembly Bill 1690, and it went through a few different iterations, but the final one would have banned the sale of single-use e-cigarettes by 2024. Our earlier drafts also would have banned single-use filtered cigarettes. One challenge was that there weren't definitions in the bill of what constituted a single-use product. The other proposal from New York similarly would have banned cigarette sales with single-use filters and single-use e-cigarettes by 2023. Neither bill has yet become enacted. There's also one bill that did become law in California this past year. SB 54 or AB 1080 was enacted this past June. And this was looking at plastic pollution in general, comprehensive legislation that is designed to deal with plastic pollution for the state. And it requires producers of covered materials under the law to join a producer responsibility organization or to stop selling single-use packaging. So under this law, tobacco manufacturers would have to join producer responsibility organizations as defined by the bill and to meet the packaging content requirements of the bill. So for example, after 2032, all of the packaging would have to be recyclable or compostable, with targets as well for the composting and recycling rates for those products. There are also requirements for producers to design plastic packaging to reduce unnecessary waste. And so this could affect electronic cigarette packaging in particular. But the covered material definition is broad enough to likely cover most tobacco products because it includes single-use packaging like the image you see here. So policy option number 2 is hazardous waste regulation. As I mentioned, electronic cigarettes are hazardous waste. So tobacco retailers that are disposing of electronic cigarettes or other electronic tobacco products should be following protocols that are set out under federal and state law. So local jurisdictions can adopt some requirements that will make sure that tobacco retailers in their jurisdiction are following these laws. And so that we are suggesting 4 different approaches. The first would be registration. So requiring for perhaps in order to get a local tobacco retail license that they are registering with the California Environmental Reporting System and also obtaining an EPA hazardous waste generator ID number. This is the first step in compliance with the requirements of both federal and state hazardous waste law, so that when a tobacco retailer disposes of tobacco products that qualify as hazardous waste, since they are a hazardous waste generator under applicable laws, they must store, handle, and transport the hazardous waste consistent with federal and state standards. So the second suggestion we have here is to require training of retailers on what those standards are and how they must be handling and disposing of hazardous waste. So this training could come from their local CUPA, the Certified Unified Program Agency, but we certainly don't want to put more burdens on the CUPAs without those costs being covered. So we suggest that the retailers pay for the costs of that training. The third would be compliance. So having certification of compliance with hazardous waste storage laws for a local retailer and completing a training on hazardous waste storage. So California law sets out minimum standards for hazardous material release response plans and inventory, for example, but there's no local preemption of local governments going beyond state law. So we could, local governments could have some additional requirements in this area of their local retailers. And the fourth would be to post signage. Many consumers may not know that electronic cigarettes are considered hazardous waste. So this is an important public service information in our view, and you could require local tobacco retailers to clarify that electronic cigarettes should not be disposed of in the regular trash, that they're considered household hazardous waste, and that this should apply to both e-cigarettes and nicotine e-liquid. And the third policy option to be discussed is environmental justice principles. So we know that in the case of tobacco retail licensing, environmental injustice also occurs as a result of disproportionate retail density in communities of color and low-income communities. So the same communities that are already experiencing a disproportionate amount of pollution from other sources are also seeing a higher concentration of tobacco product pollution. And this makes sense. Studies have shown that tobacco product waste tends to cluster where tobacco products are sold and consumed, and neighborhoods that are disadvantaged tend to have the highest retail density, and so therefore are subject to the highest exposure of toxic tobacco waste. So if you were to eliminate or reduce the retail outlets in low-income neighborhoods, you could therefore reduce the tobacco pollution in these neighborhoods and also push back on the tobacco's industry's systemic targeting of low-income people to recruit new users. So the two proposals that we have suggested in this toolkit, one would be to focus on specific disadvantaged communities. So prohibiting the issuance of new licenses or the renewals of licenses in disadvantaged communities. This could be defined in any number of ways. So you could use the California Environmental Screen, which looks at areas disproportionately exposed to pollution, or you could also look at the area of median income as a way to determine disadvantaged communities. And if a jurisdiction was interested in phasing this in a little more slowly, they could add a hardship waiver system or a limited number of license renewals to allow existing retailers in those neighborhoods to continue retailing for only the time necessary to recover any reasonable sunk costs and transition to another type of business or to a different location. The second type of policy would be a density cap. So setting a cap on the number of retailers in a particular district, and perhaps giving the local government a period of time in which they would reassess. So we suggest doing this in a district basis in this particular policy, because if you do it at a per capita level or for the entire jurisdiction, you may not get the same environmental justice benefits. And so I'll give an example. San Francisco has done this, and they set a cap on the number of retailers in any one supervisory district at 45 retailers per district. So this was slightly above the lowest number of retailers that existed in any one of the supervisorial districts at the time of the policy enactment. And their rationale was that they wanted to make sure that the policy was benefiting most those parts of the city that were already seeing disproportionate concentrations of tobacco products, and of course, therefore, of tobacco product waste. So you can see on the map on the left, this was the concentration of tobacco retailers in San Francisco before the policy. For those who know San Francisco, you can tend to see which neighborhoods it was most concentrated in, and those tended to be neighborhoods of color and most disadvantaged neighborhoods. And then you can see that there was a lot of success in the picture on the right. The green were the retailers that retailer attrition after the law passed. Red were remaining retailers. So you can see that it did succeed in bringing down the concentration of tobacco retailers significantly in the areas that were where the density was the highest. So as mentioned, this is certainly better for environmental justice perspective than addressing the problem on a jurisdiction-wide or per capita basis. And finally, I just wanted to mention the last component of our toolkit, which is a robust findings section that can be used to support these policies or some of the other policies that Amanda went through. So there's 12 pages of findings, 100 individual endnote citations. And so there's a lot of good stuff in here, research, citations, scientific studies that should be of benefit to local jurisdictions that want to point to research-backed evidence to show the harms of tobacco product waste when enacting specific policies. And finally, here is our contact information for additional follow-up. And now I think we will turn to questions from the group. So just as a reminder, I think there have been some questions put in Q&A, but if there are any additional questions that folks want to put in, then feel free to do so now. So the first question I see is if there are jurisdictions other than Manhattan Beach and Beverly Hills that have done some of the proposed policies. So I'll take a crack and then turn it over to Amanda. In terms of a full ban on tobacco product retailing or tobacco product sales, those are the only two jurisdictions I know of, but there are others that have been considering it. And then in terms of the more focused sales restrictions on looking at single-use electronic cigarettes or single-use cigarettes, then California and New York's bills are the two best examples I know of. But Amanda, anything else you want to chime in, or maybe speak to some of the other local jurisdiction actions that we've seen in California on tobacco product waste?
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So we actually host a policy database on our website that is tracking a lot of this legislation. And in Sanitas just recently, their council is considering a full public smoking ban that passed unanimously. And they are actually headed towards considering a full ban on tobacco products. That's something that they've kind of been talking about amongst the council. And in Monterey County, actually, speaking of single-use products, just passed a single-use e-cigarette ban as well.
Terrific. And then here's a question from Amaya Wooding. We've heard from youth users that the batteries of larger disposable vaping products advertised as containing thousands of puffs often fail with a significant fraction of e-liquid unused, containing possibly hundreds of milligrams of nicotine. Does having that much nicotine left over raise specific concerns for toxicity that are distinct from, say, cigarette butts or near exhausted vape cartridges? Efraim or Amanda, either of you want to take a first crack? Efraim?
Thank you. The first thing I can think of, I guess in terms of toxicity, like no amount is safe. So having more of it is just as unsafe. But what comes to mind is if these are being reports from young adults, if they're being confiscated in schools, they're requiring a larger amount of acute hazardous waste that then they have to pay for to discard. And the more waste you accumulate, the higher your cost. So if you go from a low level polluter to like a gross polluter, then you all of a sudden have to pay a larger fee. So if these are going out in that direction, or if they're being found even just like in the classrooms or in the trash cans, that kind of stuff, and they're like, what do we do with this? The offices, one, they don't know what to do with them, and two, when they figure it out, they got to pay this huge price to get rid of them. But if that were to become disassembled and then be exposed to someone's skin, or if someone were to ingest that amount of nicotine is really, really dangerous, as opposed to having maybe a little bit left in.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll just add that there are distinct harms from electronic cigarettes as opposed to tobacco, as opposed to cigarettes themselves. And it is this e-liquid nicotine. I don't know if there's a distinction necessarily between sort of a near exhausted or only partially exhausted product, but at least in terms of hazardous waste law, but both are going to have nicotine residue in them. And both of them are going to be considered hazardous waste for the reasons given. So they should not be disposed of in regular trash, although of course that happens routinely now. And then that's not really a subject for this discussion, but Efraim mentioned the schools or others who are collecting these products, if you're not a home, then you are going to become a hazardous waste generator pretty soon. And so we have some other webinars on the challenges for schools and others that are collecting electronic cigarette waste and what to do with those. Next question was perhaps providing a little bit more clarity on what a finding is and why it's important. So I'm happy to do that. So findings are often included at the when an ordinance is passed to help show the rationale for why a local government or a state government is taking an action on a particular piece of policy. And so that is to help with a court when they are interpreting the motivation for a local government taking an action. And that could be for any number of reasons that they need to review a policy and determine what the rationale was that a local government had in place. But having a robust finding section is often important for a court to look back and see, for example, that a local government was relying on their police powers to have protect the public health of their citizens in passing a law. And those are generally powers that local governments have a lot of leeway in using. So that would apply both for protecting individual users, for example, from fires or other safety hazards like that, or protecting the public from the environmental damage that you can see from tobacco product waste. Those are all areas that local governments have a lot of leeway in enacting policies. One more question that came in ahead of time is for Efraim. So what is the public awareness in your view of the environmental harms of tobacco product waste?
Thank you. I feel like we've done a lot in the last couple of years, maybe a year or so. A lot of the times the conversation revolves around health. And I feel like the just general community has still quite a long way to go. But I would, speaking on findings, I would check out some of the findings passed or used for the city of Encinitas, because they did a wonderful job combining both sides of the argument. They had the typical health harms, which by are no means to be overseen. It kills half the people that use the product when used as directed. But now if you start combining some of the environmental harms that we covered today, the pollution, if you ask any of your wastewater treatment facility what's their most troublesome or challenging like product to get out of the wastewater, oftentimes that answer is tobacco products, and it's everywhere. So the more education we have in communities, and pretty much all communities, you'll start finding organization groups or even just the general community members that want more of this information. And they're like, wow, I can help reduce wildfires, or I can have cleaner water, or I can protect this endangered species in my area, all connected to environmental tobacco harms. And then they start finding these groups that have been fighting the battle for a long time in the context of health. And then you start swaying decision makers to go in different directions and start seeing some real change. So education, man.
Absolutely. Well, an additional question that came in ahead of time, which is related. How can tobacco waste be tied to tobacco retail licensing for the public? We are trying to show environmental groups the correlations. So maybe I'll just tack on to Efraim's answer. Certainly for those that are immersed in the tobacco world, they're familiar with tobacco retail licensing, but maybe individuals who might be concerned with environmental harms aren't always. But we, in making our toolkit, tied it directly to our tobacco retail licensing model ordinance, because it is such a useful tool to have licenses for local tobacco retailers. And so that can facilitate, for example, the density options that we included, or the sales restrictions options that are there. But those options haven't always been framed in environmental terms. There's a lot of different reasons why we want to reduce the prevalence of tobacco products in our communities. But environmental harm is certainly compelling, as I think Amanda and Efraim did a great job of laying out. So there is a real case to be made to the public about the harms from these products. And I think tying it to tobacco retail licensing makes a lot of sense. It's an easy tool to make sure that we're regulating retailers. And so I think even for folks who might not be that immersed in tobacco policy, explaining tobacco retail licensing as essentially the permission to sell tobacco products, and that's the easiest tool to use to be able to control the environmental harms of tobacco, hopefully is a good hook. Efraim, Amanda, anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I think I just like to say that I think tobacco retail licenses are a great opportunity to bring, environmental justice advocates, climate change advocates, and other, water, air pollution advocates, bring those people into the fold, just to, like with the Encinitas ordinance, the city council was so compelled by the environmental reasons for this ordinance that they actually wanted to remove some of the baked in exemptions. So I think it can be a really compelling argument, and the more people that you can bring, more partners you can bring into the fold, the better.
Absolutely. And we've seen a lot of coastal communities in particular taking this to heart. I think makes a lot of sense when you think about beach cleanup and the importance of water. Certainly those aren't the only communities, but Santa Cruz, for example, passed a local resolution, I believe last year, that was highlighting the harms of tobacco product waste pollution and calling on themselves, the city council, to take action in the future. So I know they're still working on what the follow-up policies will be, but this is a really compelling argument, I think, for a lot of communities to want to regulate tobacco products. So we don't have any additional questions in the chat. So I just want to take a minute to thank Efraim and Amanda for co-presenting this webinar with us, and thank everyone for attending today. There is going to be a recording that is made available to everybody who signed up, and so that will be sent out with the link. And then there will also be a survey coming in your inboxes, so please fill that out so that we can know how we did, and if there's any other topics that you all want more information on or want covered in the future, that would be helpful. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.